Her words were numbers, her silence a secret. Welcome to Eco Misteriosa. I am your host Ravella. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in. I love reading every reply. Your voices make this journey special. Let's begin. It was one of those bracing February mornings when London lay suspended in a half-light of winter fog, its rooftops damp with soot and the air acrid with chimney smoke. I, Dr. John H. Watson, had just settled into my armchair with the Lancet when our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, tapped lightly and entered with a troubled look upon her face. "A visitor, gentlemen," she said, her voice pitched with uncertainty. "She refuses to give her name, but she's quite insistent, asks for Mr. Holmes and says it's a matter of numbers." Holmes looked up from his violin, which he had been plucking, had rather absently. His eyes, grey and hawk-like, gleamed with sudden animation. "Numbers, you say?" he said, setting the instrument aside. "Do show her in, Mrs. Hudson. A matter of arithmetic at this hour. What delight!" Moments later, a girl no older than 17 stepped hesitantly into our Baker Street rooms. She was plainly dressed, in a modest grey coat, buttoned high at the neck, and her pale features were framed by a knitted bonnet, damp with mist. But it was her eyes, intensely blue and strangely hollow, that drew one's attention. They darted about the room, taking in every detail before finally resting on Holmes. She did not speak at first. Instead, she stepped forward and carefully unfolded a scrap of paper, which she placed on the small table by the hearth. I leaned forward and saw that it contained a curious string of numbers written in a trembling but precise hand. 9. 23, 5, 12, 12, 4, 15, 23, 14, 19, 20, 1, 9, 18. 19. Holmes said nothing for several seconds. Then he gestured politely to the settee. "Please sit and tell me. Who are you and how did you come to possess this message?" She did not move. Her voice, when it came, was soft but deliberate. "I don't have a name that matters, Mr. Holmes." "But my brother does, Edward Wilton. He's missing." Holmes's brows rose. "Wilton, the codebreaker for the War Office?" I interjected. "I've heard the name. He worked on foreign cipher systems during the Sudan campaign, did he not?" The girl gave a small nod. "Yes. He disappeared 3 nights ago from our home in Wandsworth. They told me not to speak of it, that it was a matter for the authorities, but I found this slip under the loose floorboard in his study." She pointed at the numbers. "I think it's something he left for me, or for someone who might understand." Holmes had already snatched the note and was scanning it with an intensity that made his gaunt face seem almost cadaverous in the flickering firelight. "A substitution cipher, Watson. The simplest kind, though not without elegance. Observe, 1 is A, 2 is B, and so on." He traced a finger across the page. "Is clearly a misdirection," he muttered to himself, "an anomaly meant to throw off cursory eyes. Remove it, and the E message becomes 23, 5, 12, 12, and IWELL 4, 15, 23, 14, 19, 20, 1, 9, 18, 19, DOWNSTAIRS. Well, downstairs," I read aloud. "It hardly makes sense." "No, Watson. It says, 'I dwell downstairs.' And that, my dear girl, is not a cry for help, it's an invitation." Holmes rose abruptly and began pacing. "Tell me, were any rooms beneath your brother's study sealed off or long unused?" She hesitated. "There's a wine cellar directly beneath. It's quite old, hasn't been opened in years. Edward always kept it locked." "Then I suspect your brother is not the only one hiding something in that house," Holmes said briskly. "Miss Wilton, her name is Clara," she interrupted, at last offering a name with a tremor of pride. "Clara Wilton, Holmes," gave a rare smile. "Then, Miss Wilton, you have come to precisely the right place." He turned to me with an almost boyish eagerness. "Watson, cancel any appointments for today. There is code work to be unravelled and cellars to be examined. We shall take the noon train to Wandsworth." "And what do you suspect?" I asked, still grappling with the cryptic numbers. Holmes' eyes were distant now, his mind already darting through possibilities. "I suspect," he said slowly, "that Mr. Edward Wilton has vanished not through malice but by design. And if we are not swift, we may find that numbers are the least cryptic part of this affair." By 2 o'clock that afternoon, a grey, Brougham deposited Holmes, Clara Wilton and myself before the modest brick townhouse at the end of a quiet street in Wandsworth. The fog had thickened, turning the sky into a sallow blur and cloaking the chimneys and gables in ghostly half-form. Clara led us through a narrow iron gate, the sound of her boots on the gravel path unnervingly sharp in the muffled air. The house bore the respectable quietness of government service, a place of rigid habits and subtle concealments. "Third window on the right," Clara said softly as she unlatched the front door. "That's Edward's study. He worked mostly at night." Inside, the house was dim and orderly. The hall smelt faintly of pipe smoke and old paper. A tall case clock ticked solemnly beneath the staircase. Clara led us upstairs without a word, and we entered a narrow room panelled in dark walnut, its shelves lined with volumes of code theory, history, and several obscure treatises on linguistics and encryption. The desk beneath the window was meticulously neat. Holmes gave it a glance but seemed far more interested in the floor. "You said you found the note under a loose board?" he asked. Clara knelt beside the corner nearest the fireplace and pried up a narrow plank of oak. Beneath it, still marked by a faint indentation, was the spot where the folded cipher had been hidden. "I found it 2 nights ago," she said. "After Edward failed to come home. The War Office sent a man round the next morning, said he'd taken leave. But I know my brother. He wouldn't disappear without saying a word. He hated unannounced absences." Holmes crouched beside her and tapped the subfloor gently with his knuckles. "Hollow beneath, a crawl space, perhaps. Or—" He stood and turned toward the bookshelf. "Tell me, Miss Wilton, does this house have a cellar entrance from inside?" She shook her head. "Only through the garden. The rear gate and the cellar doors both have heavy padlocks." "Indeed. Yet the message claims he dwells downstairs." Holmes studied the floor again, then suddenly stooped and retrieved a small brass screw from beside the skirting. It was so tarnished and inconspicuous that even I had overlooked it. "A recent fixture was removed," he muttered, eyes alight. "Something mounted here. A bolt, perhaps, or a trap handle." He turned toward the far wall, where a tall, free-standing bookshelf stood flush against the paneling. "Watson, if you would, help me shift this." With some effort, we eased the bookcase aside. Behind it lay a narrow wooden hatch, expertly fitted and once hidden behind the shelving. Clara gasped. "I never knew—" "Your brother, evidently, did," Holmes said. "This may have been added well after the house was built. Notice the fresh saw marks here, no more than a year old and faint prints in the dust. He's used this recently." He produced a pocket lantern and dropped to one knee, unlatching the small iron ring affixed to the trapdoor. A cold breath of air rose from below, moist and stale, tinged faintly with mildew. I followed Holmes down a steep wooden ladder into darkness. The air grew heavier as we descended, and the noise of the outside world fell away. We emerged into a narrow stone corridor with brickwork arched like a wine vault. The floor was swept clean, the walls bare but for a rusted water pipe along one side. At the end stood a small iron door, unlocked. Holmes paused before opening it. "Miss Wilton," he called up, "remain where you are, if you please. We'll investigate first." He pushed the door open, and the beam of the lantern cut through the gloom to reveal a small chamber, perhaps 10 feet square. Along one wall stood a narrow cot, folded wool blankets, a shelf with 3 volumes of mathematics, and a dented kettle beside a long, cold brazier. In the corner, a wooden writing desk sat beneath a crude oil lamp. Holmes moved to the desk at once, fingers dancing across its surface. He flipped open a journal, its pages filled with dense calculations, cipher tables, and peculiar annotations in Greek letters and shorthand symbols. "This isn't merely a hiding place," he murmured. "It's a workspace. Your brother wasn't abducted. He retreated, of his own will." "But why?" I asked, looking around. "What purpose does such a retreat serve? Surely he had space upstairs." "Space upstairs." Holmes pointed to a slip of paper tucked into the spine of the journal. It read, "Dipliskia, do not trust the mirror." "Greek?" I translated hesitantly. "Double shadow?" "Indeed, and a warning. Do not trust the mirror." "Curious?" Holmes lifted the lantern and inspected the walls. "Watson, examine that paneling behind you. Something about the acoustics here." Before I could respond, A soft creak echoed from the corridor outside. We turned, simultaneously. There was no sound of footfall, no voice, just the hush of stale air and the dim outline of the ladder above. Holmes extinguished the lantern. We stood perfectly still. Then, a second creak. A slow one. From the room above, Holmes leaned close and whispered, "We are not alone in this house." We climbed the ladder without a sound, emerging into the study where Clara stood pale-faced by the door. "I heard something behind the kitchen," she whispered. "Hey, voice. Just one." Then silence. Holmes stepped lightly across the room and pressed himself to the wall beside the hallway. He waited, listened, then motioned us both to silence. From below, the cellar door in the garden slammed shut. Holmes sprang into motion, crossing the room in 2 bounds and throwing open the window. I rushed after him in time to see a figure, tall, cloaked and limping, dart down the garden path and out through the rear gate. The fog swallowed him before we could make out his features. Whoever he was, Holmes muttered, he knew the house well. Too well to be a burglar or vagrant. He turned to Clara. "You mentioned the War Office sent a man to speak to you. Did he offer his name?" "Colonel Braithwaite," she said. "He showed a badge and said Edward was on leave." I believed him at first. Holmes was already reaching for his overcoat. "Watson, I believe we must pay the Colonel a visit. There are too many shadows in this house, and I mean that quite literally." "What do you suspect?" Holmes paused, only to retrieve the cipher sheet from his coat pocket. "I suspect your brother discovered something of great import, something coded not in numbers, but in people. The cipher is only the surface, Watson. It's the minds behind it that matter. Let us see if the War Office has anything to say about the man who vanished into his own cellar and the one who just fled it." And with that, we left the Wilton house as dusk fell, the first hints of gaslight flickering along the Wandsworth Lane behind us. The air outside was no clearer than the riddle forming in Holmes's mind, but already I sensed it. The numbers were not random, and neither was the girl who brought them. We arrived at Whitehall just after 4 o'clock. The fog had grown denser, thick enough that the gas lamps lining the embankment seemed to hover as dull halos in the air, casting more gloom than light. Holmes strode ahead with his customary urgency, his coat billowing like a cloak behind him, his head bowed not against the cold but in deep thought. At the War Office, we were made to wait no more than 5 minutes before a sharply dressed lieutenant escorted us through a labyrinth of panelled corridors and into a small office whose interior offered neither welcome nor warmth. Colonel Edmund Braithwaite stood as we entered, a tall, spare man with eyes the colour of old iron and a moustache trimmed to military precision. He did not extend his hand. "Mr. Holmes," he said stiffly, "and Dr. Watson, to what do I owe this unexpected inquiry?" Holmes ignored the gesture and seated himself without invitation, folding one leg over the other and fixing Braithwaite with that unblinking stare which had once made a murderer confess his guilt before a single word was spoken. "You recently visited a residence in Wandsworth," Holmes began. "Number 6, Vicarage Row. You spoke with Miss Clara Wilton and assured her that her brother Edward had taken leave. You produced a badge, I believe?" "I did," said the Colonel after a pause. "It was the truth. Mr. Wilton submitted an urgent leave request 3 days ago on personal grounds. We approved it. Yet he has not been seen since, nor has he taken any train or coach known to Miss Wilton. You must forgive me, Colonel, but that hardly sounds like the behaviour of a man who intended to relax at the seaside or visit relatives in the country." Braithwaite's face remained impassive. "We do not govern what a man does on his own time, Mr. Holmes. Wilton was working on a highly sensitive decryption operation involving foreign communiques, Russian, we believe. Perhaps he needed a respite." Holmes leaned forward slightly, fingers steepled. "And what if I told you that Mr. Wilton constructed a secret chamber beneath his study? A room outfitted for prolonged seclusion, complete with cipher books, a journal and a note warning of double shadows and to not trust the mirror." For the first time, Braithwaite's mask cracked. His brows twitched, almost imperceptibly. "That room was not on record." "Indeed," Holmes said, softly. "And I suspect it was not meant to be, but someone else knew of it. Someone who entered it yesterday while Miss Wilton was upstairs. We found evidence of recent intrusion. The Colonel clasped his hands together, his knuckles whitening. That is deeply troubling, Mr. Holmes. Holmes rose. More troubling still is the conclusion I have drawn. Your department was either infiltrated or complicit. The man who fled from the cellar was not acting at random. He had knowledge of Mr. Wilton's private installation, his movements, and possibly the nature of the work he conducted in secret. I intend to find out who that man is. There was a long pause. Then, almost against his nature, Braithwaite nodded. Come back tomorrow at 9. There are files I must clear with Internal Affairs before sharing, and Holmes, Wilton's work was being handled under the Veil Protocol. If you know what that means, you'll understand how little room we have for error. We stepped back into the fog, and Holmes walked in silence for a block before speaking. Veil Protocol, he murmured. A regulation for decryptions too delicate even for military channels. In essence, the War Office buries the source and the message alike. Wilton must have uncovered something they were not prepared to acknowledge. We returned to Baker Street in time for a pot of oversteeped tea and a pair of kippers that Mrs. Hudson produced with sympathetic concern. Holmes barely touched either. Instead, he drew the cipher sheet from his coat pocket once more and spread it across the table. His eyes did not blink for a full minute as he stared at the series of numbers. Then he made a sound, not quite a laugh, but something close. Watson, he said, tapping the page. Do you recall how the message read? I dwell downstairs, Guy, I answered promptly. Exactly. A clever little riddle, yes, but its construction puzzled me. The initial 117, it seemed a red herring, but I now believe it is the key. How so? 117 is not part of the code. It is an index, a reference. Page 117. He stood and strode to the shelf where he had earlier placed Wilton's decrypted journal. Flipping rapidly, he stopped at page 117 and read silently for a moment. Then his lips parted. Here, he said, listen to this. The mirror lies twice. First in what it shows, then in what it hides. One must study not the reflection, but the source. He closed the book with a snap. I believe Wilton discovered something encoded not only in ciphers, but in the behavior of his superiors. The double shadow may refer to a double agent, someone posing as an ally, and the mirror. Perhaps it is literal, perhaps not. But he left a trail. These messages were not for the War Office. They were for someone else. Clara suggested, possibly, or someone within the office he hoped would find them if he failed. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson returned with a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes opened it with the air of a man who already suspected its contents. To Holmes, Baker Street Wilton's room ransacked. Tonight stop journal missing stop. Miss Wilton safe. Bert distraught stop local constables uninformed stop. Inspector Lestrade. Holmes crushed the telegram in his fist. They're moving too quickly, he said, eyes alight with a fire I had come to associate with his most exhilarating cases. The thief knew where to look. This wasn't a common burglar. The page number clue, someone else deciphered it. You think they're trying to erase Wilton's trail? Not erase, he replied grimly. Collect, assemble. Whatever Wilton uncovered is too valuable to destroy. They want it intact, and we must get there before they do. That night Holmes slept not at all. He sat beside the fire, making notes, drawing lines between seemingly disparate ideas, and occasionally muttering about mirrors and shadows. I retired at midnight, but when I rose at dawn he was still there, eyes bloodshot, collar loosened, but no less intense than before. Watson, he said without looking up, we are going to the Royal Mathematical Society this morning. Wilton was a guest lecturer 2 months ago. If he left further hints, they may be hidden in plain sight, among minds sharp enough to recognize the language of codes, but naive enough to miss their deeper implications. And if we're being watched, then let them watch. For the spider may observe the fly, but it's the hand that moves the web. And with that, Holmes donned his hat, pocketed the cipher, and stepped out into the morning mist with the calm of a man who sees beyond the fog. The Royal Mathematical Society on Hanover Square had all the austerity one might expect from a sanctuary. Of number and proof, high-arched ceilings, rows of solemn busts, and a faint scent of must and vellum that clung to the air like an equation without solution. It was just past 9 when Holmes and I arrived, the building only beginning to stir. Their clerk in spectacles directed us to the archives chamber, a long, narrow gallery where visiting lecturers were known to leave annotated versions of their presentations for posterity, or, in rarer cases, for obfuscation. Holmes moved along the shelving as though guided by intuition, though I knew better. His hand halted near the end of the W section, where a slim folder bore the name E. Wilton in tidy script. He withdrew it and spread the contents across a table by the window. There were 5 pages, dense with formulae, tables, and occasional marginalia, in a neat, restrained hand. At first glance, they seemed like the ordinary remnants of a talk on modular arithmetic and transpositional ciphers, but Holmes, as ever, saw what I could not. "Note this line," he said, tapping the upper right corner of the second sheet. "All mirrors conceal more than they reflect. Beware the symmetry that deceives. It's not mathematical, at least not in the way they'd expect. This is philosophical, Watson, or perhaps tactical." He began scanning each page for patterns, murmuring under his breath. Then something made him pause. In the final paragraph, he refers to a convergence of signals at a location called the oblique room. That's no mathematical term, I know. "Nor I," I said. "It sounds more like a place than a concept." "Exactly, and not metaphorical, I think." Wilton was careful. If he intended to leave a message, he would embed it just where those with a little knowledge could miss it entirely. "Come, let us speak with someone who might know more." We were soon escorted to the private offices by a thin, harried man named Mr. Albert Gorst, the Society's archivist. He seemed both honoured and alarmed to be speaking to Holmes, though he quickly warmed to his subject. "The oblique room," he repeated, frowning. "Yes, I've heard the term used informally. It's not a room in this building, though. It's a sort of private study chamber, below the old lecture hall in Chancery Lane. Some of our more eccentric members used it to scribble and puzzle without being disturbed." "Locked?" Holmes asked. "Not usually, but it's obscure. Few even remember it exists. I believe it hasn't been used in some months. Then it may be precisely the place where Wilton stored something he couldn't entrust to his house or the War Office. With directions in hand, we made for Chancery Lane, the fog now lifting enough to see a few weak shadows beneath the eaves. Holmes said little during our journey, but kept checking the folds of his coat and occasionally fingering the cipher slip in his pocket. We reached the old Society Hall just before noon. The caretaker, a gnarled man named Crimmins, who looked as though he'd been born with a ring of keys at his waist, took some persuading before he led us to a crooked stairwell that wound downward into damp stone. At the end of a tight corridor stood a single door, set at a slight angle to the hallway, with a worn brass plate that read, "Oblique Study Room, Members Only." Holmes turned the knob slowly and stepped into the gloom. I followed, lighting a lamp. On the wall. The room was plain but well kept. 2 chairs, a table, a writing desk, and a wall of narrow drawers filled with blotting paper, nibs, and sealing wax. Holmes moved to the desk immediately, pulling out drawers with swift precision. The third drawer he stopped. Well, he muttered. Inside lay a single sealed envelope, unmarked but for a series of small holes punched along the flap, 12 in total in no discernible pattern. Holmes drew it out with care and held it to the light. No writing. But this whole pattern, it's deliberate. Wilton may have used a numerical punch code. Can it be deciphered? Possibly, but I dare not open this here. He slipped the envelope carefully into his inside coat pocket and turned to inspect the rest of the room. In the corner, under a layer of dust, was a chalkboard, its surface covered in an intricate sequence of diagrams, interlocking circles, a lattice of prime numbers, and one final symbol at the bottom right, a triangle within a triangle, surrounded by 3 dots. Holmes stared at it for a long moment. "Do you recognize it?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "It's a cipherist's signature. Wilton must have believed someone would find this, perhaps a colleague, perhaps us. But more importantly, he's marking territory. This room was his. Recently. Just then, footsteps echoed above. Measured, deliberate. Holmes extinguished the lamp and motioned for silence. We heard the outer door creak open and a voice, a whisper, hurried and breathless. "Nothing." "Already taken," it said. Then retreating steps. The door shut again. Holmes waited 30 seconds before relighting. "The lamp. They're trailing us now," he said. "The ransacking of Wilton's study wasn't a one-off. Someone is attempting to retrieve or suppress every trace of what he left behind. We are now part of the equation." Outside, Holmes hailed a cab and gave an address I did not expect. "Kensington, the residence of Professor Jerome Wexley." "Wexley," I said, "the cryptanalyst?" "The same. Wilton cited him as a mentor in one of his early papers. If anyone might understand what these codes mean, and whom Wilton feared, it is he." Wexley's home was a tall, narrow edifice of red brick and white lintels, half smothered by ivy, and graced with a door that bore no knocker. We were admitted by a manservant with sparse words, and led to the study, where Wexley, a heavy-set man with spectacles like portholes and a shock of grey hair, sat surrounded by tomes. "Holmes," he said without standing. "I wondered how long it would take you." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Then you've been expecting me?" "I've been expecting someone. Wilton came here a fortnight ago in great agitation, left me a sealed packet with instructions. If he failed to collect it by the end of the month, I was to deliver it to a Mr. H. at Baker Street." He reached beneath a stack of correspondence and retrieved a narrow envelope bound with string. Holmes took it, slit the seal, and read. I watched his brow furrow, then rise. "It's not a letter, it's a riddle, 3 lines only." He handed it to me and I read aloud. "The glass shows truth only when it lies. The voice that counts is not the one that speaks. To find me, seek where the false numbers meet." Holmes turned to Wexley. "What did he mean by false numbers?" Wexley shook his head. "I've no idea." But he believed someone close to him, possibly within the War Office, had been feeding disinformation. Numbers that led nowhere. He called them dead vectors. A code unto themselves. Holmes paced for a moment, then abruptly turned toward the door. "We're running out of time, Watson. Wilton is not merely missing, he's being hunted. And I fear we are approaching the part of the game where players begin to disappear for good." He pulled his coat close and murmured, "The false numbers, the mirror that lies, and now a voice that doesn't speak, all pieces of one design. We are close, but close to what I do not yet know." And with that, we left the house as the first drops of rain began to fall, each footstep echoing with the weight of something vast just out of reach, waiting, concealed, and watching. The rain quickened as we left Professor Wexley's house, a steady, whispering drizzle that streaked the gas lamps and turned the Kensington streets to a sheen of black glass. Holmes said little as we walked, though I could tell from the sharp set of his jaw and the narrow focus in his eyes that his mind was in overdrive. He was sorting through the threads, ciphered clues, hidden chambers, veiled messages, all pointing in the same murky direction, like the slow tightening of a noose. "The voice that counts is not the one that speaks," Holmes murmured as we reached the main road. "Wilton's riddle grows more provocative by the hour. Do you believe he's still alive?" I asked, lowering my umbrella against the slanting rain. Holmes turned his gaze on me, unreadable. "If he is, it's by the grace of his foresight and the slowness of his enemies. But every message we find was left with urgency. He anticipated pursuit, Watson. Perhaps even capture. We are not merely trying to find him, we are chasing a man who knew he was running out of time." We boarded a hansom and made for Baker Street. The city passed in a blur, wet and wavering, but Holmes remained silent, eyes fixed on the envelope he had retrieved from the oblique room. It was still unopened, and now, at last, in the warmth of our sitting room, he laid it gently on the desk and withdrew a small brass stencil from the drawer. "This," he said, "was used during the Franco-Prussian War for a rudimentary form of punch code decoding. The holes in the envelope flap, 12 in total, may correspond to letters when overlaid against a standard alphabet grid." He aligned the stencil carefully, then held the result to the lamplight. A faint series of letters appeared, written only where the holes allowed the ink beneath to be visible. REACH, THE, VOXing stared at it, then looked to Holmes. "The Vox, is that Latin?" It is, he said, your voice. The connection is clear. The voice that counts is not the one that speaks. We're meant to reach a voice, but not one that talks. A code, I asked. A ciphered communication? Holmes nodded. Or a device that communicates without language, something recorded, stored, or symbolically silent. He turned to the shelf and withdrew Wilton's journal from our earlier visit to his cellar chamber. Flipping through the entries, he paused at one marked with a red corner. It was dated just a week before his disappearance, a voice in silence. Not spoken, seen. The numbers repeat because they are not true. Their symmetry conceals. Look at what doesn't change when the rest does. That's where the voice lives. Holmes tapped the edge of the page. Look at what doesn't change when the rest does. Watson, recall the cipher message Wilton left. I dwell downstairs. That phrase was symmetrical in structure, but the word dwell stood firm at its center. I began to see it then. He's telling us to ignore the patterns that change and focus on the ones that remain. The fixed points. Holmes had already retrieved the cipher again. Let's examine the numerical sequence. Ignore the first number, 117, and look only at the remaining ones. He spread the numbers before us. 23, 5, 12, 12, 4, 15, 23, 14, 19, 20, 1, 9, 18, 19. Now, he said, overlay a grid of letters from A to Z, 1 through 26. Then note which letters repeat. He circled them as he spoke. Appears twice. L9 appears twice. I-23 appears twice. W-19 appears twice. S, lose, he muttered. An anagram, perhaps. Switch the order. Wills? Swill? But I was already frowning. No. What if it's a name? Holmes looked up, eyes suddenly sharp. Wilson. There was a long pause, then he straightened. Colonel Braithwaite mentioned no one named Wilson, he said. But Wilton's early research papers list a co-author on 2 occasions, Dr. Theodore Wilson, a cryptographic theorist, quiet, obscure, and likely overlooked. I crossed to the writing desk and checked the compiled notes we had gathered from Wilton's flat. Among the archived correspondence, a single letter bore a W, Theodore Wilson, addressed from a location on Fleet Street. Holmes stood at once. If Wilton left his clues to reach the voice that doesn't speak, and Wilson is the silent collaborator, then we must reach him before someone else does. It was nearing dusk when we arrived at the modest townhouse off Fleet Street. The buildings here were tightly packed and older than most, grimy with coal soot and shadowed by the taller banks and publishing houses nearby. We rang twice and a narrow-eyed woman answered, peering at us with suspicion until Holmes presented his card. This is regarding Mr. Edward Wilton, he said calmly. We believe Dr. Wilson may be in danger. The woman hesitated. Upstairs, second door. We climbed the creaking staircase and knocked. The door opened slowly to reveal a small, hunched man in his 50s, hair disheveled, eyes blinking behind thick spectacles. His clothes were clean but askew, as though sleep and meals had become irregular. You're Mr. Holmes, he said flatly. I thought it might be you. You've been expecting me. I've been expecting someone. Edward said that if anything went wrong, it would be either the authorities or you. Sit. We entered the narrow flat, its shelves crammed with notebooks and mathematical texts. Wilson moved to close the curtains before speaking further. They've been watching this building. Not all the time, but often enough that I've noticed. Edward came here 2 weeks ago. He was frightened, though he hid it well. He believed. His work had uncovered something buried, someone in the War Office feeding doctored data into the decryption streams. False numbers, I said. Wilson nodded. Yes, but not just to confuse our foreign adversaries. They were rerouting information, directing attention toward phantom messages, while hiding real correspondences beneath symmetrical patterns, mirror ciphers. Edward believed someone internal was passing intelligence through these fakes. Holmes stepped forward. And the voice, the vox? Wilson hesitated. It's not a person. It's a device. Edward built it in secret, a modified telegraph, receiver program to interpret signal anomalies and reconstruct hidden messages from symmetrical sequences. He called it the Vox. He kept it with him in the cellar workspace. It wasn't there when we arrived, I said. Then someone has it, Wilson replied darkly. And if it's the same person who ransacked his room and the oblique room, then they are closer than we are to understanding the full scope. Holmes leaned against the mantelpiece, his eyes narrowing. Dr. Wilson, we must retrieve the Vox. If it contains decoded transmissions from this mole— It does, Wilson interrupted. Edward showed me a fragment, a schedule, names, code names, yes, but he suspected they were drop-off points, agents within the city. He feared they were building something, coordinated. He used the phrase, a second network beneath the first. Holmes turned toward me. Watson, we are dealing not with a single spy, but with a system, a false system layered atop a real one, a parallel channel of deception. And the Vox is the only instrument that can read it, I said quietly. Holmes gave a single nod. Then we must recover it, whatever it takes. Whatever. Wilson suddenly stood unsteady. You'll need to hurry. If Edward encoded the Vox's final logs using his fallback protocol, it would require 2 keys, one of which I have. He reached beneath his desk and retrieved a narrow metal box. This the secondary key. Without it, they won't be able to access the deeper layer of the logs. Holmes took it solemnly. Then we have one advantage, at least. Let us pray it is enough. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the fog remained, thicker now and somehow heavier, like the air before thunder. Holmes glanced up at the pale gaslight flickering over Fleet Street. Someone is very close to pulling a curtain over the whole of this, he said. But not yet. Not while we still hold the key. And with that he turned into the mist, a silent figure threading his way toward the invisible lines of a plot not yet fully drawn, but quickly closing in. We left Wilson's flat with the key, to the Vox in Holmes's inner pocket, and a rapidly darkening sense that time was thinning around us, like the last hourglass grains in a narrowing glass. The fog had grown nearly opaque now, muffling hoofbeats and swallowing the outlines of buildings like a slow-moving tide. Holmes paused on the corner of Fleet Street and Fetter Lane, casting a glance over his shoulder. We're being followed, he said in a voice barely above a whisper. I turned discreetly. A man in a bowler hat, too well dressed for the district, loitered with the manner of someone determined to appear aimless. He lit a cigarette with the same match twice. Holmes tugged at my sleeve and we turned down a narrow alley, emerging into a mews behind a butcher's. From there we slipped through an archway and out onto Chancery Lane again, doubling back toward the embankment. He was no amateur, Holmes muttered. He used the false match trick. Trained, I'd wager. Probably War Office or something more clandestine. You think Braithwaite has set someone on us? Holmes shook his head. If Braithwaite were involved, we'd be watched more carefully and more invisibly. No, I believe we've attracted the attention of whoever stole the Vox, and if I'm correct, they don't know yet that we possess the key. At Baker Street, Holmes locked the front door himself and instructed Mrs. Hudson to admit no visitors, not even Lestrade. Then we settled in, the envelope containing the Vox key opened and spread across the table. It was a narrow brass plate with 2 rotating dials and a series of etched letters along its edge. Holmes held it reverently. Beautifully done. This isn't just a key, it's an interpreter, a decoding gate. If the Vox is paired with this device, Wilton's fallback logs become accessible. Where do we start? Holmes stood and paced slowly before the fire. Wilton stored the Vox in his secret cellar. When we arrived, it was gone. Someone had already broken in. That same individual returned later, searching upstairs. Now, according to Wilson, the Vox. Logs contain data about a parallel network, likely a list of embedded agents, disguised channels, and schedules for communication drops. All masked by false numbers within symmetrical codes. He paused, brow furrowing. But whoever has the Vox now cannot read its final entries without this key. They'll soon realize that. That gives us a small window in which to act. I watched as Holmes retrieved the ciphered journal once again. He turned to a page we hadn't closely examined yet, one marked only with a faint ink blot and an underline on the phrase, "The lamp does not cast light. It reflects a shadow." Holmes stared at the line. Watson, when we visited Wilton's cellar study, did you notice anything out of place? I thought back. Only the strange neatness. It looked as though it had been cleared deliberately, except for the journal and the bedding. Exactly, Holmes said. And the oil lamp, too clean, recently polished. Why would someone polishing a lamp leave a diary behind? He rose suddenly. We must return to Wandsworth, tonight. Despite the hour and the damp, we found ourselves back at the Wilton residence by 9. Clara opened the door with alarm, but calmed at Holmes's expression. Has something else happened? Not yet, Holmes replied. We require access to your brother's cellar. One more search. She led us down without question. Holmes immediately crossed to the oil lamp in the corner and unscrewed its brass base. I heard the faint click of something giving way inside. He tipped the base, and from it slid a tightly folded strip of waxed paper. Holmes unfurled it with care. Scrawled on it in tiny, cramped writing was a series of numbers: 8, 5, 12, 9, 15, 14, 12, 15, 22, 5, 18, 14, 5. Another substitution cipher. I asked. Holmes nodded, writing beneath each number, A Setcha 1, B Churcher 2. Zchilchum 26. He worked quickly. Schatz was beyond the alphabet's range, but he frowned and circled it. Too high. Deliberate, perhaps. But the rest reads Helionloverne. Helion? I asked. It's an old alias. Wilton once published a paper under the pseudonym A. Helion, an allusion to the sun's core, symbolic, I suspect, of hidden energy. And Loven? A private club, Holmes said quietly. Loven House in Mayfair, an innocuous gentleman's club by appearance, but Wilton mentioned it to Wilson once as a meeting place for a certain fringe society of information theorists, mathematicians, cryptanalysts, and former military operatives, quietly eccentric men with minds sharper than decorum allows. He stood. That's where the Vox was taken, or at least where it will be deciphered, and that's where we're going, tonight. We reached Loven House before 11. The club's sandstone facade bore little signage, just a brass plate by the bell. Holmes adjusted his scarf and rang once. A doorman in dark livery answered. We're here for a demonstration, Holmes said, with a smile that could disarm any suspicion. Mr. A. Helion's latest invention. You'll find our names on the temporary guest list. The doorman hesitated, then nodded. Second floor through the reading room. The interior of the club was quiet, almost reverent. The walls were lined with books and eccentric objects, antique telescopes, astrolabes, even an orrery in one corner ticking faintly in the dim gaslight. We passed two men hunched over a chessboard, their whispered remarks barely audible. Holmes led me unerringly to a rear door. He paused and listened. Inside, voices, low, intent. He pushed the door open gently. 6 men sat around a table. At the center sat the Vox, a small black box with brass fittings and a roll of spooled paper feeding through it. Symbols flickered. In the lamplight as the device clattered softly. They looked up as we entered. No one moved. I believe that belongs to Mr. Edward Wilton, Holmes said calmly. And unless I'm mistaken, you've not yet managed to access the final logs. The man at the head of the table rose. His face was thin, unsmiling. It took me a moment to recognize him. Colonel Braithwaite, Holmes said, not blinking. I wondered when you would stop pretending to be merely concerned. The colonel didn't deny it. This device contains sensitive national information, he said. It was constructed with military knowledge, and by law, it is subject to seizure. Holmes stepped forward. And yet, here you are, in a private club, operating without sanction, without uniform, and without authorization. I wonder what your superiors would say. The tension was like a drawn bowstring. Holmes reached slowly into his coat and withdrew the key plate. Every eye followed the motion. You haven't been able to open it, have you? Because without this, he held up the brass key. It's little more than a box of mechanical gibberish. Braithwaite stepped forward. What do you want? Holmes's expression was ice. I want the truth. Braithwaite paused, then gave a short nod. Give me the key and you'll have it. Holmes didn't move. You'll let me operate the Vox. No one else touches it. You'll stand back, and when the final log prints, I decide what leaves this room. The men exchanged glances. One, a younger man with a trimmed beard, looked about to object, but Braithwaite raised a hand. Agreed. Holmes stepped forward, inserted the key, and turned the dials. The Vox clicked once, then began to spool. with new speed. The room was silent, but for the sound of paper being drawn out line by line, and when the printout emerged, coded still but no longer concealed, Holmes tore it free and read it silently. Then, softly, almost to himself, he said, "My God, what does it say?" I asked. Holmes looked up, eyes shining with grim understanding. "It names 4 operatives, 3 of them high-level advisors, embedded in the Foreign Office, the Admiralty, and the Cabinet itself. Not spies merely, Watson. Architects. They've been building the false network, not to confuse enemies abroad, but to control narratives within." He handed the paper to me. "And one more name," he said, "a directive, to silence Edward Wilton, permanently." Braithwaite did not react, but his face was pale. Holmes turned toward him. "Would you like to explain that, Colonel?" But Braithwaite said nothing. He simply turned and walked out into the hall. Holmes folded the printout. "Get Lestrade," he said. "Now." And so, at long last, the web was no longer invisible, but it was still tightening. It was nearly midnight. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the Vox safely tucked beneath Holmes's arm, and the coded printout folded within his coat. Outside, the rain had ceased, but the fog clung to the city with the weight of secrecy. Every lamp seemed distant and muted, every footstep on the pavement an echo. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door, her brow furrowed with a tension that had become all too familiar since the case began. "A gentleman came by not 15 minutes ago," she whispered. "Didn't give a name. Said he'd return shortly. I didn't let him in, of course." Holmes gave a tight nod. "You were right not to. Lock the doors. No more visitors tonight." We ascended to the sitting room, and Holmes placed the Vox gently on the desk, his expression unreadable. I poured 2 brandies, while he retrieved the cipher sheet and placed it alongside the decoded log. The 2 together formed a map, not of streets or locations, but of influence. Names, dates, meeting times, and references to mirror transmissions, signals sent through legitimate channels, obscured by false codes embedded within otherwise innocuous reports. Holmes sat in his armchair, fingers steepled, and stared at the list. "What we hold now, Watson, is not merely a record of espionage, it's a blueprint for internal sabotage. Wilton was not just trying to expose a traitor, he was trying to uproot a second government operating in the shadow of the A. First, and Braithwaite. He may not be the architect," Holmes murmured, "but he was no mere observer. His silence tonight was not guilt, it was fear. This web reaches above even his authority. He knows if this information leaves our hands, unguarded, it may be buried forever." I crossed to the window and peered through the lace curtain. "If the conspirators know we have this, they won't wait long." "They won't," Holmes said, "which is why we must act before dawn." He stood and retrieved a small envelope from the desk drawer, scribbling a brief note. "To Lestrade?" I asked. "No," he replied. "To Mycroft." I blinked. "You're a brother?" Holmes didn't look up. "No one in England has more influence behind closed doors. If we move without him, we risk walking into a trap laid on both sides, one by the enemy, the other by those trying to contain the scandal. This requires a scalpel, not a hammer." He sealed the envelope, rang for Mrs. Hudson, and instructed her to dispatch it by private runner to the Diogenes Club immediately. 10 minutes passed in near silence. Holmes read through Wilton's original journal once more, pausing often, absorbing every margin note and ciphered sentence, as if committing it to memory. Then there was a knock, 3 short, precise raps, and Holmes moved to open it himself. Mycroft Holmes stepped inside, his imposing frame framed by the mist beyond the door. His expression was unreadable, as ever, but his eyes held a strange urgency. "You understand what you've done," he said, by way of greeting. Holmes gestured to the armchair. "I understand what Edward Wilton tried to do. I'm merely finishing what he started." Mycroft sat heavily and accepted a brandy. "This Vox, the contents. I presume they're authentic?" Holmes handed him the printout. "Authenticated by Dr. Theodore Wilson, who co-designed the Vox. The decoding was completed less than 2 hours ago." Mycroft read quickly, lips compressed. When he finished, he set the paper down with great care. "There are 3 names here that, if made public, could unseat half the Admiralty." "I know," Holmes said, "but the alternative is worse. Mycroft was silent for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "Doctor, I admire your loyalty, but if you have anything resembling a nervous disposition, I suggest you remember nothing after tonight." I straightened, feeling my spine stiffen. "I'm familiar with danger, sir." Holmes smiled faintly. "He's already been shot twice on my behalf, once in the shoulder." "That was a dog," I muttered. "A very large dog," Holmes corrected. Mycroft allowed himself a tight sigh. "Very well. I can have men at Loven House within the hour. Quiet men. The club's front is already under surveillance, though not by our department. The moment we move, someone on the inside will try to erase this. We'll need to flush them out without triggering a broader panic." Holmes stood and crossed to the hearth. "Then we'll offer them a trade." Mycroft's eyes narrowed. "A trade?" "The original Vox," Holmes said. "We let it be known that we intend to deliver it to the Foreign Office at dawn. An informal handoff, public, traceable. We'll invite the conspirators to act. When they do, we'll be watching." "They won't come themselves," Mycroft said. "They'll send intermediaries. That's why we'll set 2 traps," Holmes replied. "One at the handoff, the other at Clara Wilton's house. That's where they'll go to silence the final voice. They'll assume she has a copy." Mycroft considered this, then stood. "I'll handle the surveillance. You handle the bait." Holmes inclined his head. "Then let us begin." The next hours passed in a quiet storm of preparation. Holmes drafted a false memorandum indicating the delivery of the Vox at first light. On the steps of the Foreign Office, a foolishly symbolic location, as though we had never learned subtlety. The message was leaked through a deliberately careless postal drop, certain to be intercepted. Meanwhile, Lestrade, finally brought into the fold, arrived with 2 men in plain clothes, tasked with watching Clara Wilton's house from 2 separate vantage points. She was warned of the danger and moved to a secure location known only to Holmes and Mycroft. The house was left as bait. By 4:30, Holmes and I stood beneath the colonnade of the Foreign Office, the first threads of dawn just beginning to break the grip of the mist. In Holmes's gloved hand, he held a simple wooden case, not the Vox itself, but a dummy constructed to resemble it closely. The real device had already been handed off to Mycroft's couriers and was en route to a location known only to 3 people in the country. We waited. At precisely 4:58, a black carriage rounded the corner. It stopped too far back for its occupants to be seen clearly. Moments later, a tall man in a long coat stepped out alone, walking toward us with slow, measured strides. Holmes did not move. When the man was 10 feet away, he stopped. "You have something that belongs to us," he said. Holmes gestured with the box. "Only if you can prove it." The man didn't smile. "You're surrounded." Holmes nodded slightly. "So are you." From both ends of the square, Mycroft's men appeared, quiet, swift, precise. In seconds, the man was restrained and the carriage taken. A second man attempted to flee from inside but was brought down by a single shot fired into the air. At that same moment, a runner arrived breathless at Holmes's side. "The Wilton house," he gasped. "They tried to break in, caught 2 of them. One wore office badge, the other private security. Neither talked." Holmes turned to me. "They've lost. Not all of them will be found, but the structure, the hidden structure, is broken. What remains will scatter." I looked out across the square as the sun finally pierced the fog and cast pale light on the columns behind us. "And Wilton?" I asked. "If he's alive." Holmes's expression turned thoughtful. "If he is, I believe he'll come back. Men like Wilton don't vanish forever. They retreat, recalculate, and return." We stood in silence as the bells of Westminster struck 5, ringing in a new morning for London, a city that for a moment had walked perilously close to being ruled by shadows. And thanks to a girl who spoke in numbers, it had stepped back from the edge. By midday the following day, London had settled into a hushed tension. The newspapers remained curiously silent. No headlines about a foiled espionage plot, no whispers of arrests at Loven House or break-ins in Wandsworth. That silence, Holmes said, was proof enough that Mycroft's hand had done its work. Public calm, he remarked, is too often maintained not by truth but by omission. In our sitting room at Baker Street, a thin haze of tobacco smoke drifted toward the ceiling. Holmes, cross-legged in the armchair, was polishing the brass edges of the Vox. Not out of sentiment, I thought, but from some deeper instinct to preserve the tool that had exposed such intricate treachery. The device was no longer active, its spools removed and safely stored, but Holmes treated it with a reverence I rarely saw. Lestrade had come and gone not an hour before, pale with exhaustion, but nearly reverent in his gratitude. "Your brother's kept this off every official docket," he had said, "but between us there'll be 4 resignations before the week is out, and the man from the square," he'd lowered his voice, "dead in his cell, cyanide capsule. No name, no past, clean as bone." Holmes had only nodded. I poured another cup of tea and sat across from him. "There's one thing still troubling me." Holmes glanced up. "Only one, you're improving. The Vox's final log named 4 operatives, but we've only heard of 3. Admiralty, Foreign Office, Cabinet. The 4th was only referenced as Asset C refracted. It was the only one not linked to a location or rank." Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw something shift behind his eyes. He tapped the side of the Vox with one long finger. "Refracted, bent, redirected. Not a primary actor, but one used to distort something else. Mirrors again, Watson." Wilton's metaphors were maddening but consistent. "Could it be a transmission node?" I offered. "A device? Or a false identity?" He studied me for a long moment. "Or a person, one used by the others to mislead, to draw attention away, to serve as both bait and buffer." And then quietly he added, "I believe I know who it is." I felt the silence pull tight around us. Holmes stood abruptly and crossed to his desk. From the bottom drawer he withdrew the original cipher note Clara had brought to us, now crinkled, and softened from much handling. He laid it next to the wax paper strip we'd discovered in the oil lamp, and began lining the numbers side by side, comparing them carefully. "Notice the structure. The false cipher was always a misdirection. But it's not random. Certain numbers like 12 and 23 repeat. They're stabilizing figures, anchor points. Whoever constructed the cipher built it not to confuse all eyes, but to fool one specific decoder. A tailored illusion," I frowned. "But that would suggest someone knew who would find it." "Exactly. And who brought the cipher to us?" "Clara," I said slowly. Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Clara Wilton." I sat upright. "Holmes, surely not. She was terrified. Honest." "Terrified, yes. But honest?" He returned to his chair. "I believe Miss Wilton is Edward's sister, in fact, but I no longer believe she was merely a bystander." He opened the copy of Wilton's journal we had retrieved from the cellar and flipped to a page near the end. He handed it to me, scrawled. In the margins, faded and hurried, were the words "C watches," not Clara, but C. "If she finds the Vox before Holmes, burn it, refracted mirror. The voice won't speak until it sees." I looked up slowly. He knew she might betray him? Or be used against him, Holmes said. Either way, she's the 4th vector, the refracted asset. Her emotional appeal led us into the case, yes, but also guided us to specific conclusions. She emphasized certain clues, led us to the cipher, always a step ahead, yet never seeming so. I stood and paced to the window, heart sinking. Then, "It was all manipulation?" "No," Holmes said quietly. "It was both. I believe she truly wanted to find Edward, but I also believe she was instructed to deliver the cipher under very specific circumstances. Perhaps she was promised his safety. Perhaps she was told only a portion of the truth. But she is not innocent." Turned toward him. "What do we do now?" Holmes stood. "We go to her." She was waiting. That was clear from the moment we arrived at the temporary lodging in Bloomsbury. The constable posted outside greeted us with a solemn nod, but Clara herself opened the door before we knocked. Her face was calm, too calm. No tears now, no anxious wringing of hands. "I wondered when you'd come," she said, stepping aside. We entered the modest room. No packed bags, no signs of flight, just a woman sitting at a writing desk, a single candle burning low beside a closed book. Holmes did not sit. He remained standing just inside the door, tall and silent. "You've read Edward's journal," she said after a moment. "He always did write too much." "I've read enough to know you guided us," Holmes replied, subtly, effectively, "and I suspect under orders." She did not deny it. "You think I betrayed him?" "I think you were used," Holmes said, "but not without your knowledge. You brought us the cipher when you could no longer decode it, and when the Vox was taken, you knew we were your best chance of retrieving it." She turned her gaze to me, and for the first time I saw no fear in her, only sorrow. "They told me Edward had turned, that he was feeding information to the Russians. They showed me doctored pages, transmissions faked to look like his." Holmes was motionless. "But you doubted." "I never fully believed it," she said, "but I believed enough to help them track him, hoping it would clear his name. I didn't know about the Vox until 2 days before I came to you. And when you realized what they really wanted," I said softly. "You switched sides." She nodded. "I gave you just enough to follow the trail, but never everything. I was trying to play both ends of a fire." Holmes exhaled. "And now the fire is out. The network is exposed. Edward may yet live." She looked down at her hands. "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not here to offer it," Holmes replied. "But you should prepare to give a statement. Mycroft will arrange a sealed hearing. You'll not face prison, I suspect, but you won't walk freely either." She nodded. "I'll say what I know." Holmes turned to leave. I followed. At the door, she called softly, "Mr. Holmes." He paused. "Do you think he's alive?" Holmes answered without looking back. "Yes, because even in the dark he left a light." Outside, the first true sunlight in days broke through the clouds, casting long lines of gold across the rooftops. Holmes walked silently beside me, his stride neither rushed nor slow, as though a balance had returned to the world. "What now?" I asked him. "We wait," he said. "For what?" "For the man who spoke through silence to return." And though he said nothing more, I knew he believed it. Somewhere Edward Wilton was alive, watching, waiting. And when he returned, it would not be in cipher, but in clarity. Over the next 2 days, Baker Street remained quiet, though not in the way of peace. The air in the flat was dense with expectation, as if even the furniture sensed the final pieces of the puzzle had yet to fall into place. Holmes sat for hours at a time by the window, staring into the grey London fog as it shifted against the glass, his pipe smouldering in one hand and a worn page of Wilton's journal in the other. The Vox had been delivered under guard to an undisclosed vault within the War Office per Mycroft's orders, where it would be sealed until Parliament could be convened in closed session. Clara had given her deposition in full, painful, clear-eyed, and implicating no fewer than 2 mid-level operatives and a foreign attaché. Her position, as Holmes had predicted, remained ambiguous. Neither criminal nor victim, she became a reluctant thread between opposing forces, just refracted enough to bend the truth in both directions. Holmes had spoken very little since our visit to her. He had taken to rereading Wilton's final cipher phrases with the same intensity one might apply to scripture. Each line became both prophecy and puzzle, and I knew he sensed something still amiss, some corner of the architecture left obscured. It was late on the 3rd night when the silence broke. There was a knock at the door. Not the casual rap of a messenger or constable. A single knock, firm and even. Holmes stood before Mrs. Hudson had even reached the stairs. I followed him to the hallway, my instincts tensing. He opened the door. Edward Wilton stood on the threshold. He looked thinner than before, his face more hollow, eyes rimmed with the sleepless strain of someone who had seen too much of the dark. His coat was weather-stained, his hat damp with the fog, but he stood upright, steady. Holmes stepped aside without a word, and Wilton entered. He moved to the center of the sitting room and stood silently, glancing at the familiar surroundings, as if they were half-remembered dream. Then he turned to Holmes and spoke in a low voice. "I didn't know if you'd find the Vox. I wasn't sure they'd leave enough behind." "We did," Holmes said, "though not before others tried to bury it." Wilton sat, his hands clenched, between his knees. "They came for me the night I left the journal, not the ones Clara worked for, someone above them. I escaped through the garden cellar, then disappeared into Shoreditch. I couldn't risk even Clara seeing me. Not then." Holmes's expression was unreadable. "Did you know she was being used?" "I suspected," Wilton said. "But not how deeply?" "She didn't realize at first. They told her lies mixed with just enough truth to trap her. They used her as bait, for me and for you." "You played a long game," I said. He nodded. "I had no choice. The network was too broad. Every message I decrypted led to another name, another blind alley. But once I saw the repeated number, patterns, the false constants, as I called them, I understood the truth. They weren't just encoding messages, they were creating ghost paths. A system built to simulate activity and hide real transmissions behind a wall of meaningless data. "You constructed the Vox to penetrate it," Holmes said. "Yes, and I left it because I knew I couldn't finish the work alone. I had to vanish. They were closing in. Once they discovered I'd isolated the mirror vectors, it became a race to silence me, or worse, use me." Holmes offered him a glass of brandy. "The name in the final log, Asset C, refracted. That was Clara." Wilton closed his eyes briefly. "She'll live with that more than you know, but she came through in the end. You saw to that." Holmes did not respond immediately. He stood and walked to the fireplace, staring into the ash-darkened. "Great. They've arrested 3, I said. "Braithwaite has disappeared. We suspect exile, not prison." "There were more," Wilton said. 5 core architects. One of them is still inside the War Office. He didn't appear on any logs because he never transmitted anything. He was the endpoint. Do you know who?" Wilton reached into his coat and withdrew a single sheet of paper, yellowed and folded in 4. He handed it to Holmes. The writing was sparse. 3 dates, a series of cipher tags, and a single name written in plain script, Wyndham Harrow. Holmes's expression remained unchanged, but I saw his fingers tighten around the page. "Director of Naval Intelligence," he murmured. "That's why it stayed hidden. The 4th operative was never upstream. He was the basin, the collector." Wilton nodded. "He never sent a message. He only collated, absorbed, and distributed in person. No ink, no wires. His hands stayed clean because they never touched the signal. But he was always there, reviewing the mirror paths, approving the signals, placing men." "Do you have proof?" I asked. Wilton looked at Holmes. "Only what the Vox decoded, and one more thing. Something I kept with me in case I didn't. Make it back." He pulled a thin envelope from his inside coat pocket and handed it over. Holmes opened it, revealing a strip of photographic film sealed in wax paper. I leaned in, and even in the low light I saw the outlines of a coded meeting schedule. Dates, location points, and at the top, a signature, W. Harrow, Internal Convergence. Approval. Holmes's voice, when he spoke again, was low and firm. "This is enough." Wilton exhaled and sat back, as if 20 pounds had lifted from his frame. "Then it's over." "No," Holmes replied. "It's finished, but it's not over. Mycroft will see to it that Harrow is removed, but not publicly. They won't risk the scandal. Your name may never be cleared officially." Wilton nodded. "I understand." Holmes regarded him. "And what will you do?" "I've had enough of codes," Wilton said quietly. "I'm going to Ireland. My uncle owns a small farm in County Wicklow. I'll vanish again, but this time with purpose." Holmes stepped forward and extended a hand. Wilton took it. "You broke a system that fed itself on silence." "That counts for something," Holmes said. Wilton gave a tired smile. "Only because you listened when no one else would." When he left, it was past 2 in the morning. The streets were quiet. Holmes watched him go from the window, his silhouette swallowed by the lamplight mist. We sat in silence for some time after that, the fire reduced to coals. Then Holmes spoke. "There are victories, Watson," he said, "that require no fanfare. Only that the right man walks away unburdened." "And the girl?" I asked. "She spoke in numbers," he said softly, "but she learned to live in words. I believe she'll be all right." And in the quiet that followed, I thought, for once, he truly believed it too. It was 3 days after Edward Wilton vanished once more, this time not in fear but in finality, that Holmes received the envelope. It arrived by morning post, hand-delivered by a uniformed boy whose nervous gait suggested the sender had impressed upon him the importance of discretion. Mrs. Hudson brought it up herself, setting it beside Holmes's untouched breakfast with a curious glance. The envelope was unmarked, but for a simple cipher of 3 interlocked circles on the wax seal. Holmes froze at the sight of it. He picked it up, examined the seal for no more than a moment, and then sliced it open with the edge of his knife. A single sheet of paper slid out. His eyes scanned the contents once, then again slower the second time. "What is it?" I asked, rising. He didn't speak at first. Then he passed me the note. It was typed, neatly, formally, and contained only 20 words. "Asset C has been relocated beyond reach. The mirror cracked, but not all the reflections are gone. We see. You still. No signature, no heading. Just those words, taunting, opaque, and unmistakably a warning." Holmes tapped the table with 2 fingers as I read. "They've not all been routed," he said, half to himself. "Someone survived the collapse. Enough to send this, and enough to remind us the silence is not absolute. It is not absolute." "Do you think it's Harrow?" I asked. "He was meant to be dealt with." "By Mycroft," Holmes replied, "and my brother is thorough, but not infallible. Harrow might be detained, exiled, or hidden under some new bureaucratic name. But if this note is connected to him, it would mean the last root of the network hasn't been pulled. Then they're waiting." "Yes," Holmes said. "Waiting, watching, perhaps even rebuilding." I frowned. "But Wilton's work is safe. The Vox is locked away. The name's exposed." "Exposed," Holmes echoed, "but only to those who wish to see. The public will never know. The machinery of empire depends on its secrets being cleanly buried." He stood and walked slowly to the window, gazing out into the pale morning haze that clung to the rooftops of Baker Street. "There's a flaw in most conspiracies," he said. "They assume revelation is their end. But sometimes exposure only causes mutation. The body rots, yes, but parts adapt, crawl on. The game doesn't end, it only changes players." He turned to me, a rare gravity in his face. "We may have defeated the mirror, but something still lurks behind the glass. The rest of the day passed in silence. Holmes wrote a single note to Mycroft and sent it by private runner, stating only, "The reflection persists. Recommend surveillance on all prior assets. Wilton's retreat must remain unknown." No reply came that day or the next. Clara Wilton, I learned through Lestrade, had been moved to a quiet residence outside Bath, under a different name. It was said she had begun writing, fiction of all things. A strange irony, I thought, for one who had once lived in ciphers to take refuge in stories. But perhaps that was her way of reshaping truth, no longer as a puzzle but as something soft, something that breathed. By the end of the week, the fog lifted. London returned to its rhythm, the headlines concerned once again with parliamentary squabbles and naval readiness, not hidden codes or vanished men. Holmes busied himself with smaller cases, a missing diamond in Belgravia, a contested will in Marylebone, but I could tell he moved through these with only half his mind. The other half still lived in the shadows left by the Vox. One evening, as we returned from a particularly dull interview with a paranoid solicitor, who believed his cat was being impersonated by a foreign agent, a claim Holmes dismissed after precisely 9 seconds, I found him at the mantel again, staring into the fire. "I've been thinking, Watson," he said slowly, "about the original cipher Clara brought us. The first message, I dwell downstairs. It was crude, simple, almost too simple." He turned toward me. "I believe it was meant to be found, but not by us." I straightened. "Then by whom?" Holmes walked to his desk and drew out a fresh sheet of paper. On it he began transcribing the cipher numbers again, but this time in a different order, grouped in 3s, then 4s, rotating their positions. "There's a layer we didn't consider," he murmured. "Not because it was complex, but because it was elementary. Wilton built his Vox to read complex obfuscation, but what if his first message wasn't a code at all?" I watched as he restructured the numbers, then paused. He drew 3 letters, C. "US's in the margin. Initials?" I asked. "No," Holmes replied. "A designation, not Clara Wilton, but rather cipher warning level. It's a term used internally by War Office cryptographers to indicate a message designed to test enemy handlers. If it's acted upon, the test reveals interception." "You think Wilton sent the cipher as bait?" I think he sent it to someone, knowing it would pass through Clara's hands and that we would find it. He used us, Watson. Just as much. As he used the Vox. We were part of the apparatus. Then why tell us anything at all? Holmes smiled faintly. Because he trusted we'd do what others wouldn't. Investigate the wrong angle long enough to discover the right one. He folded the paper and slid it into the fire. We were his mirror, Watson, reflecting back what he needed the world to see. And now with the Vox buried and Wilton vanished, the reflection must fade. I poured 2 glasses of brandy and handed him one. And what do we do now? He raised his glass. We wait. We listen. And when the glass cracks again, we'll be ready. He sipped. Then, after a long pause, he said softly, "They'll try again, of course. Shadows never disappear. They merely retreat behind newer walls. But for now, this war of mirrors is over." I sat back in my chair watching the fire crackle and spit, and though Holmes returned to his violin that evening, the melody he played was not sharp nor stormy. It was slow, thoughtful, a closing chapter in a tale few would ever know had been told, and somewhere in the countryside or abroad, a man who once lived in silence, in numbers, in codes, lived freely, perhaps even happily. For though the game had changed, the pieces had not forgotten where they once stood, and neither had we. It was 3 weeks to the day since Edward Wilton's quiet reappearance and final departure when the true resolution arrived, not with a gunshot or cipher, but in the form of a book. Holmes and I had just returned from the Strand, where we had interviewed a particularly nervous pawnbroker about a forged ruby, when we found a modest parcel waiting on the hall table. No return address, only a wax seal, no longer the tri-circle cipher of before, but a single sunburst impressed in pale blue. Holmes carried it up to our sitting room, slit the paper, and withdrew a slim volume bound in soft grey linen. The title was embossed without, "Flare, Echoes from Below," a collection of short stories. Beneath the title page, in fine, slanted handwriting, was a simple note for Mr. Sherlock Holmes and the good doctor who saw the pattern before it sang. C.W. Holmes turned to the table of contents and ran a finger along the titles, each seemingly benign. The Man Beneath the Stair, The Room with No Lamp, Numbers in the Garden. But it was the final story that made him stop. The Girl Who Spoke. In Numbers, he read it in full silence. I watched as his expression shifted, from curiosity to recognition, and finally to a small, knowing smile. When he finished, he handed it to me without a word. The story, told through the lens of fiction, traced the journey of a young woman trained in observation, tasked with delivering a message she only partially understood. It described a brother, shrouded in secrecy, a hidden room beneath a home, a device that could hear truths others buried. The story had been disguised as allegory, but it was no such thing. It was a confession. And a final breadcrumb. Beneath the dust jacket sewn into the book's spine, I found a thin strip of card, barely thicker than paper. Holmes unfolded it carefully. Typed, in the same precise font as the previous message, were 4 words: Windsor, April, Signal 1. He read it twice before slipping it into the fire. "What does it mean?" I asked. "It means she's not done," he said. "And neither is he. But they're not enemies any longer." "No," he said. "They've become something else. Not agents, not pawns, witnesses, carriers of truth that must surface. Only when the soil is ready." He stood stretching, and for the first time in many days, there was something unburdened in his step. "You see, Watson, the truth is rarely delivered like thunder. It does not burst through doors. It whispers, it waits, and sometimes it writes stories." We stood by the window as the late April sun filtered through the clouds, the city alive with the rhythm of another spring. Below, the world moved on, unaware of the war that had nearly torn its heart out through silence and symmetry. Holmes turned to me with that rare flicker of warmth he saved for quiet victories. "It's over. Not because we solved it, but because they did, Clara, Edward. They understood something most of us never will." "What's that?" I asked. "That codes are only dangerous when left unread. But truths? They're only dangerous when no one listens." And so the final echo of the Vox faded, not in wires or whispering fog, but in words set quietly on paper, passed hand to hand, hidden in fiction. London never knew how close it had come to being ruled by shadows, and it never would. But Holmes knew, and so did I. Knew, and so did I.